Well, greetings, compadres. I'm going to do kind of a mashup. Your mystery meat sandwich, kind of combined, flowing straight into your chaplain's chat today, because I have a guest today who I'm going to introduce in a second, but you'll see when it happens. I'm going to kind of weave the mystery meat sandwich quote into this. And I just wanted to jump right into this because I have a treat for you, and it is a treat better than the cake machine at the Paris Hotel at the 20 Books Conference, which is where I met this woman. And, here's the thing. I met her at the conference. Oh, not the cake machine, just so you know, just to clarify. But when I had a couple conversations with her, we were on a memoir panel together, a memoir authors panel together, and she was leading it. I just felt this instant warmth and authenticity from this woman. And not to sound like some kind of a weird, creepy person like Bridget Fonda from Single White Female, that old movie, nothing like that, but I felt a connection to her. And there's always something in me that can see a light in somebody else that just really glows strongly. And this is how I felt about her. She's kind of an enigma. I don't think you will have any clue what her story is, how much she survived. She's a survivor of an unprecedented amount of things. And so here's the deal, because that glow and that light, coupled with being a survivor, it all fits and makes sense to me that she is in the helping profession also. And so my mystery meat sandwich quote is, look for the helpers, which of course is Mr. Rogers, or at least attributed to Mr. Rogers. All right, so currently, no, I'm going to back up. So I touched on that she survived unspeakable things as a child and teen, but now she's using her voice to advocate for changes in the systems that caused her harm. She currently works as a hospitalist physician in California, and she spends her free time writing and volunteering. And she is the author of, and I've got a copy here that she gave me. It is called Hindsight, Coming of Age on the Streets of Hollywood. There it is. Please welcome Dr. Sheryl Recinos. Hello, Dr. Recinos.
Hi
Is
there.
it okay
Thank you
if I
for
call you
having me.
Sheryl? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. So what I would love to do is just let you unpack however much you'd like to unpack about your background. And I'm just going to hand you the floor and feel free to just start sharing.
All right. Hi, everyone. So, my name is Sheryl Recinos, and yes, I am a hospitalist physician today. But who I was 20, 30 years ago is the person that shaped who I am today. I often walk into rooms full of physicians and realize a lot of the people that I'm surrounded by wouldn't have even glanced my direction when I was younger, wouldn't have listened to me, wouldn't have heard my words. And so I'm honored to be able to speak up for people who still have no voice until, that changes. I'll continue fighting for them because we need a voice for all people, especially people who have no safety net, no housing, no, you know, family that can support them through their most difficult times. So as Amy said, I was a homeless youth. I was struggling as a teenager, and I came from significant dysfunction in my own childhood, as the youngest of five children in a family that was quite broken. My mother was bipolar, and my father, for all intents and purposes, I suspect he is a narcissist, and he was my guardian. But him being the guardian of children when he didn't want to parent made my life a living hell. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to just sit down and be quiet like some of my siblings were. And I started to push back and fight for safety, but that put me in more unsafe situations. As I pushed back, my dad started to, control more, and he, put me into a psychiatric hospital when I was 11. and left me there for 2.5 months. And, as an adult in my 40s, I hold no psychiatric diagnoses. There was no reason for me to be there. I was a traumatized child, and the system didn't protect me. Instead, it abused me, it harmed me, it forced medications at me, placed me in isolation and restraints for trying to use my voice and begging for safety and begging for an adult to listen. After I got out of that facility, I went back into my dad's house, still 11, still scared, and nothing had gotten better because the problem wasn't, that I was a difficult kid. The problem was that there wasn't a parenting structure in place that protected me and dealt with some of the trauma I'd already, experienced in my young life. And so I started running away. It was the natural next thing to happen when I was afraid for my safety at home. But running away put me into, significant dangers. I ran away at first locally within my hometown, and that didn't work. I ended up going back home each time. And so I decided I needed to go far enough away that I couldn't cave in and go home. Because for me, home wasn't safe. And I took money from my dad and I bought a bus ticket to the furthest place I saw on the map. I was a dumb kid. I opened up a map and said, well, Los Angeles looks pretty far away. And I bought a bus ticket to Los Angeles at 13, and they sold it to me and let me travel alone across the country with no one asking my age. But it wasn't just that no one asked my age, it was that, there were predators on the bus that were paying attention to my age. And so that didn't end well for me when I got to Los Angeles because one of them followed me and made sure that, he caused harm. I ended up in Hollywood afterwards because someone at the bus station where I ended up noticed that I was, in turmoil and I was crying and scared. And she told me about some of the programs in Hollywood. She told me there was a shelter program for kids like me. And I'd never heard of programs like this. I came from North Carolina and it was a place where, you know, they did have group home facilities. They did have a lot of like the treatment facilities that, you could put kids in if kids were determined to be bad, like what we call the troubled teen industry now, places that definitely cause harm and put all of the blame on the youth. But they weren't places like this, places where someone was listening to my needs and making sure those needs were met. And so I ended up in one of the shelters, but I was still very afraid. I spent a night in one of the teen shelters and then I left and I went to stay on the streets. And unfortunately, because I was so young, the staff were really worried and they talked to my dad and decided to have me arrested for being a runaway. And I ended up going right back to my hometown and I had to stand in front of a judge and make a decision. And at that point, it was, am I going to go back into this environment with my dad? Or am I going to beg for something different? And so I begged to go into foster care. And, surprisingly, I was the second kid in my family of 5 children that ended up in foster care. And that's unusual. Usually they take all the kids. But where I grew up, it was, again, all the blame was on me. This was my fault. There was something wrong with me. And so I was being taken and put into a system of care because something was wrong with me. But, what I needed was my one adult. Back then, I had one person that I trusted, and that was my mom. And she was non-custodial and she had mental illness. But we had one of those really, significant bonds. And every system of care I got placed into, from the hospital to foster care to later on when I ended up in juvenile prison, no one would let me call my mom. They said that she wasn't my custodial parent. And even when I was in foster care, everything still deferred back to my dad. And so I wasn't allowed to talk to that one adult that grounded me. And so I kept running because if I couldn't have that one thing, that one person who believed in me, I didn't have anything. I was like untethered. And so I kept running until eventually, the judge was tired of me and still no one was asking me why I was running away. The judge pressed charges, or my dad pressed charges, and the judge allowed him to press charges for when I had stolen money, when I had bought that initial bus ticket. And I ended up being charged, it was a misdemeanor, larceny, for $250. I was sentenced to up to 2 years in maximum security juvenile prison at 13 years old. I looked up a couple of years ago what that sentence would have been if I'd been an adult when I took that money. It would have been 24 hours of community service. So instead, I had to give up to 24 months of my life and have complete, fear and pain and shame for what I had, done. And yes, I was wrong. I shouldn't have taken the money, but at the same time, no one was asking why. And as a mom of three, I wouldn't blink twice if one of my kids took that money. If they took that from me, I would ask why. I would ask what need was unmet and how I could help them. Because I believe in a completely different type of parenting.
Mm.
But, going back to what happened, when I got out of the juvenile prison, the foster care had dumped me right back into my dad's custody and nothing had changed. And again, I was the one that was, the person who was at blame for everything. And so I'm right back in my dad's custody. I'm almost 15 years old. I have a stepmom that hates me. And it was just one thing after another. And it took me hitting rock bottom and having a severe suicide attempt for, my probation officer to step back and say, maybe you shouldn't be on probation. Maybe there's something else going on here. And then eventually my stepmom left. And then things got eerily quiet for about a year. When it was just my dad and me in the house, we didn't interact. He went to work. I went to school. I went to work. I had a full-time job. I was getting straight A's. I was applying for, scholarships. I was in all of the activities at school. I was running cross country. I volunteered at the soup kitchen. I was a good kid. And, one night, one of my brothers came to visit, and I was 16 at that point. And my dad said, I don't care if you're here or not when I come home. And by then, I'd had so much trauma, and I'd been trying to count down the days until I was 18 that I said, you know what, enough. I have money in the bank. I'll figure it out. I pulled all my money and I left. And I ended up back in California where it turns out the streets for me felt safer than home.
Hmm.
And they weren't safer. There's no safety for young people on the streets. There's no safety. But in my mind, that was still better than going through all of that again, than going back into the hospital system, the risk of going back into prison, the risk of going back into foster care. My dad had brochures about different like wilderness camps he could send me to. And again, I was a good kid. I was volunteering and in sports and working, had no problems at work. I wasn't one of those like bad kids that people talk about. I was a traumatized child. And that's what I want people to see. Like a lot of the time when we talk about bad kids, we're talking about traumatized children. We're talking about kids that have unmet needs. And it's our job, instead of looking at what they're doing, to look underneath that and see what their needs are. And so that's who I come to you as. That person who I was as a teenager formed who I am now. And I didn't realize that that person, had made me who I was until I actually got into medical school and I sat around all my other colleagues, my future doctors, and started to listen to their worldviews and their backgrounds and their histories and how their families were arranged, and realized that thing that happened to me as a kid was profound and it affected every aspect of my life, down to who I advocated for and my belief in social justice. So everything that I had gone through made me into this person that can't look away. And so that's who I am.
So beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's such an honor to hear that. And it's very piercing. Your book, your story, I encourage everybody listening to read Hindsight. It is almost magical because of all of that and who you are today. And the whole concept, right, of turning something around, negative experiences, perceived now in a way like where your past becomes your greatest asset because you're able to help people now. I thank you for sharing it. And so, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about teen homelessness to start with. Well, actually, a couple things. Precursor question to that is, how do you think kids would recognize, this family system that I'm being brought up in, it doesn't seem quite right. And the reason I ask that is because, as a kid, you're sort of like growing up thinking that this is normal and that everybody, experiences this. It's kind of got those like blinders on. And so, um, what would you say to kids who are in a normal kind of family situation? What's the line and the difference?
I mean, I think it's hard to tell when you're in that situation as a young child. And I think that's why it's so great that we have some tools, at least within the medical field, to start trying to identify who these kids are. There was a study called the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, that came out in the 90s. And it turns out that young people who undergo significant childhood trauma end up having all of these adult illnesses like obesity, diabetes, cancer, autoimmune conditions, COPD, liver disease, addiction problems, depression, anxiety, all the things that really, break us as adults. And, as we've moved further with the research, we've started to come up with tools to actually identify young people where we're asking questions like, you know, questions that get down to the root of it, like, is there safety at home? Is someone being hit? Is someone in jail? Is someone using drugs? Do you feel safe? Do you feel loved? And those questions sometimes can be a good screening tool for kids that might not realize their environment is so, uniquely different
Mm-hmm.
from what we're hoping that kids are experiencing. And then that's like a stepping point to getting people into resources. So that's an advancement in the past couple of years in medicine.
Mm, love it. I love it. And so, really feeling that power to confide in your pediatrician, maybe, or a trusted adult and ask questions, maybe even. Do you think? Or,
I think, every kid needs at least one trusted adult. And
yeah.
I can think of several that were, groundbreaking in helping me get my life on track as a teenager.
Mm,
And maybe they didn't think that their, involvement was as groundbreaking as it was, but they were those trusted people that helped me pull myself together and get through the hardest times.
mm. And so, okay, so going back to the idea that I touched on earlier about talking about teen homelessness, uh, this is a problem, right? Like this is a big problem. What are what are some of the tools that you could recommend that if someone finds themselves in a similar position, what to do?
I mean, there's so many levels to this because we've got, an underestimated number of young people who experience homelessness at any given time. It could be as many as 2 million people in a year or higher of young people who don't have stable housing. And it's not identified well because we have, different definitions of what it means to be homeless. Like if
Mm,
you have, an unstable place where you're going to stay, like if you're living on a sofa, if you're in a temporary housing, if it's a place like a shelter versus if you're outside under a tent, in the inclement weather. And so it's hard to say because you first have to define what the problem is. And truly, it's anybody who has that unsafe, temporary, or no housing at all, and they need a place to stay that's permanent and supportive. And so we've got all of these young people, and what they need is they need connection, they need
yeah.
programs, they need housing. When we look at who is on the streets, who is homeless, who that population is, it's made up of young people who aged out of foster care. So
Mm,
kids that, we said, we're going to do better than that house that you came from, and we're going to put you into a system that will protect you. But we don't, because then when they turn 18, they don't have a place to go. And unfortunately, as many as 40 to 50% of those young people within 18 months of leaving foster care end up on the streets. So they make up a huge component of who's on the streets. But then we have our LGBTQ youth. And unfortunately, I just see this number rising with all of the changes in what's going on politically across our country. We've got kids that have been pushed out of families, kids that don't have safety at home. I saw one statistic that 25% of young people, the day they come out to their family is the day they become homeless. They lose their house, they lose their safety, they lose their parents and their family and everything because of who they identify as. And that's wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
then we've got this disproportionate number of kids of color, kids who are Black, Latino, Indigenous, who are on the streets. And when you mismatch that, when you see like kids who meet all those criteria, kids who were in foster care, maybe also identify as LGBTQ, maybe they're Black and Latino also, what resources do we have for those kids? Not enough. Definitely not enough. We need housing for everyone. And that's my big push. Because when I'm looking at this problem, you know, I'm looking at these young people, and I volunteer at one of the homeless youth programs that helped me as a teenager. And I see these kids, and it angers me that
Mm-hmm.
this is still a problem. Like, I went through all of that 20 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and we still haven't found a solution to get kids off the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's raining right now in Los Angeles, and they
Mm-hmm.
have to go out and find a place to stay for the night where they can stay warm and dry and safe from predators.
I can't imagine. And here's the thing, too. When you were talking about the streets actually feeling like a safer choice than your house with your dad, your living situation, that like hit me like a lightning bolt because, you know, they say that, home is supposed to be a safe place, right? And when you don't have that basic foundation of safety, right? Um, what do you do and where do you turn? And the fact that the streets were a better choice than being at home that's pretty terrifying. And I guess I'm wondering, I'm sure that, this is layers and layers deep, I'm sure, but um, if people are interested in doing something active, where's the starting place?
Definitely, it's looking within your community and seeing who's already on the ground and who has like a homeless youth program. I know for me in Los Angeles area, I work with my friend's place, and they're in Hollywood, and they're a drop-in program. They meet the needs during the daytime, but again, they're unable to offer shelter. We need housing. Like it's amazing that we're able to provide people's needs and meet those basic needs like food and hygiene supplies and bus tickets, bus tokens, things so people can get around. But we need a plan that eventually provides housing for all of these young people. And so it's looking to find that program within your community and helping, advocate
Mm,
for that next step, because we can throw a lot of money at a problem without fixing anything. And always, yes, we need to provide what people need to meet their basic needs, but always we have to remember housing
mm,
is the answer for homelessness, and
mm-hmm,
supportive housing where people who have been on the streets have endured so many traumas both before they got onto the streets and then during. And so it makes sense that after coming off the streets, anybody who's experienced that, whether it's for a short period of time or a long period of time, they need significant care. They
mm-hmm.
need a case manager, they need connections to like mental health resources such as therapy. They need access back into the medical system because a lot of them
Uh,
have developed medical issues. And so all of these things need to be met. And it's not just putting someone in an apartment and walking away, it's providing those resources because that just meets the basic needs. But now we need to help get them employable, maybe consider an education. And those things just aren't possible when we're still dealing with that trauma at the surface level that hasn't been met or addressed.
yeah. I love that you mentioned that because it almost seems like, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like, yeah, there's the mental health piece of it, which is huge, and having support for that, maybe some other outlying addictions or, harm reduction, all these needs, right? And then there's physical housing, you know, actually a place to sleep at night that's safe. Eating, probably eating 3 meals a day or eating something every day. And it's just it's fascinating to me how many different ways there must be to help. Now that we're kind of talking about this, I'm thinking about all these different, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all of this. And yeah, I just think that such a good, solid tip is look within your community, you know? I mean, this isn't something anybody can sort of snap one finger and, it's done and it's over kind of thing. So really getting boots on ground and being hands-on. That's amazing. And one thing I was wondering about too is, did you ever have a spark of like, you know, if I ever get off the streets, if I ever get out of here, what I'd like to do someday is help other people. Did that come to you at all during your homeless time?
So when I had my first child, I struggled with housing during that whole pregnancy. And even until I was at the end of my hospital stay when I was about to leave, I wasn't really sure where I was going to go when I was discharged. And I ended up moving in with a friend who let me rent his sofa for 100 a month, which was ideal because it gave me a safe place to stay. And so I was dealing with that homelessness even as I became a new mom. And I remember when I first held her and I was looking at my baby and I realized, this is what I want to do. This hospital environment is amazing. And I had no reason to trust doctors or like the hospital after the times I'd been in the hospital as a younger kid. And the doctors and the nurses were unkind to me. Like it was a really horrific experience. I ended up filing a complaint with the hospital after my child was born because of some of the cruel things that were said to me in the process. But I had a pediatrician who came in, and he was my child's first doctor. And when he came in the room, we connected instantly because he said, this is my first day of training. I'm an intern. Your
Mm,
baby is my first patient. And because she's my first patient, that makes her special. And talk about like life-changing words for someone
mm,
like me that had experienced, homelessness and incarceration and foster care and just like a lack of sense of self and family. For someone to come in the room and look at my kid and say, your kid is special, it was life-changing for me. And
mm.
so in that environment, I just kept looking at like, okay, these doctors were really cruel to me. And this one doctor for my kid was amazing. I want to be a doctor. I want to get in here and be a voice for people that no one listens to. I want to take care of people the way I should have been taken care of. And that first hospital stay was what planted the seed. And it took 12 years before I got into medical school. It was a very long process, but I got there because I was still fighting for that young me who needed a voice and needed someone to advocate for her.
Oh, so beautiful. It's just so lovely to think too, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that would be the fuel that would keep you going through that process of, 12 years. And just, I mean, it's kind of funny once you get a calling like that and you just pursue it, it's almost like nothing can stop you. It's like, I'm going to do this. And
I agree.
it's
It was an
so,
unstoppable dream, and I pursued it much harder than I think anyone expected me to.
so becoming a mom, that must have been incredibly just overwhelming. And I mean, did you have just this instant connection with your daughter when she was born?
I did. I was so grateful that I had a chance to raise a child in a safe, loving environment. And even though in those early years we didn't have much, we were struggling, she gave me purpose. And I
Mm,
made sure that she had safety and food and all the things that, really, really mattered. But I fought to make sure that, her life and then her siblings, they all had this different environment than what I was raised in.
mm,
Um, I eventually married her dad, and we have two other kids. And, they made it through all of those childhood years and then adolescence, which was quite challenging.
mm,
And then now they're all adults.
mm-hmm,
And so I've seen them go through those years where, their life was very different than mine had been.
mm,
And really, when they hit those teenage years, that was when I started to really sit there and sift through my own experience and say,
mm,
well, when I was a teenager and I was at the homeless youth shelter, if I cursed at a staff member, I would get kicked out. My punishment for cursing at an adult was homelessness and risking my life.
mm,
But my kids, they've cursed me out plenty of times because it's just something kids do when they're testing their vocabulary. It's not that, it's not that they need to be punished to the extent that they could die for saying a bad word, And so my approach to parenting was very much under this, understanding that, a lot of toxic things are done by parents and by adults towards children as reactions to behavior. When
Mhm.
instead, sometimes I need to remove myself from the situation if I'm upset, or sometimes I need to try to figure out why they're reacting the way they are. And so it created a whole different type of parenting within my household. And so I'm very proud to say that my kids are all adults now and they did not go through the traumas that I went through. And they're all, doing quite well because they're safe and they've been protected and somewhat spoiled, which is amazing. And I love that part.
I
But
love
yeah,
it. I love
I love it.
okay, so I love that you talked about getting to the root of whatever it is, right? Because I believe so much in that. I believe in getting to the fear under the fear under the
Mhm.
fear. Like really what's going on? Because it's certainly not, that you didn't turn your assignment in and you had detention. Like that's not it. And so I'm wondering how did you, so you're probably having flashbacks, I would imagine, or some kind of remembrances from your own youth. How did you begin to even sort of process that and then watch your kids kind of simultaneously? I'm sure you did work before, when they were younger, but how did you get through that? What were some of the tools you used?
I mean, I didn't do the work. I Given my experiences growing up, I was terrified of going back into any kind of therapy because therapy was never safe for me. But, I was able to heal through, writing and talking about my experiences. And when the kids were younger, I surrounded myself by like mentor moms who could really guide me through the process. And so I've always had some moms who are a few years ahead of me in parenting who I've been able to, talk through things with and get guidance from. And so that was very healing for me to hear and see, people that I think are doing a wonderful job with their kids and have really, successful, healthy, happy kids. Listening to them helped. And
Mhm.
then I'm in several, parenting groups, like, the Facebook parenting groups that we're all in. I'm in several that are, dedicated to female physicians because our workload is insane. And then throw into that, raising kids in an environment where I might have to work 12, 14, 16 hours. And so it was very helpful to surround myself with people going through that same experience and really, find the ones that matched my parenting style and befriend them. And so I set up my community full of people that, shared values with me and kept mentors in my life that mattered to me from before. Like I'm still friends with the director of the homeless youth program. And, one of the moms I met when my first child was a baby, she was the PTA president at the school that my kid ended up going to. We're still friends and she's a mentor mom. And so I've got these people that kind of fulfilled those roles for me that I needed filled.
Mhm.
And they've helped guide me along the way so
Mhm.
that I don't lash out and say the wrong things to my kids. And, sometimes I have, nobody's perfect. But I also learned, I apologize. I go to
Mhm.
my kids and humble myself and, really own my behaviors or words or experiences and make sure that I pull myself out of the situation and make it not about me
Mhm.
because I recognize the things that caused me harm.
Mhm.
And honestly, I feel like since I started writing and speaking about my experiences, I became a better mom because I really started to go through all of the different experiences and realize where the harm was caused
Mm.
and fought to not cause that harm to my own kids.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, that's incredible because I was wondering how much I'm sure your kids know your story, to some extent, but um, do you find it's tough to balance between like, okay, this is your journey and your experience, child, and this is mine. Do you just kind of wing it and sort of go on like, well, this feels appropriate that I'm going to talk about this? Or Because my big deal for my story even is I just I just tell it and I just kind of go, this is what happened to me. And I'm not saying you're me, but I just know that, it came from a place of whatever, feeling rejected, fearing abandonment, whatever it was. And I'm just wondering, are you careful with how much you share, or how do you navigate that? Or I guess now, now that they're adults, right? It's a little bit different, but when they were teens.
So when they were younger, I didn't tell them my story,
Mhm.
but they went with me when I volunteered at the homeless youth program and they met staff from there. And I think they started to pick up clues that my life was a little different. And
Mm,
beyond that, we didn't have like the grandparents to go visit because, my mom was unhealthy and we rarely visited my dad. I didn't cut contact until 2017. And so we would still visit every couple of years. But for me, it was definitely challenging, like trying to decide when to start telling them my truths.
mhm,
And I wasn't sure I was ready to start telling them about my experiences. And then my family told them.
mm,
We were visiting, and my dad told my kids, well, when your mom was 13, she ran away to California. And, I said, wait, that's my story to tell. And there's a whole lot more to that story than just saying when I was 13, I ran away to California. And I got very upset and I didn't speak with my dad for the rest of that trip. And I went to talk to my brother and I said, if this continues to happen, because it had happened a few times when I was introduced to, new people I'd never met. I was introduced as that little sister that ran away at 13. And I told him, if this continues to happen, I'm done. I'm not coming back because, a lot has happened since I was 13. I'm like almost a doctor. I was in medical school. I'm like, I have these 3 kids. I'm married in a successful marriage. My life is in a completely different place. And there were a lot of things that happened that made me run away at 13, but you guys don't let me speak about those things.
mm.
And so because they brought it up, my kids started to ask about it. And at that point, my kids were like maybe 7, 10, and 13. And so the questions started to come, but I kind of pushed them away for a while. And then when we moved back to California for residency, like the training that happens after medical school, I got into a program in Riverside County, which is like right next to Los Angeles County. And I started volunteering again and bringing my kids again. But now they've seen the world. They've gone with me to the Caribbean, they've gone with me to New York, to Florida. And now we're back in California because med school was a whole whirlwind of travel. And moving back, now they've seen so much that we started talking a little more about the experiences because they're noticing still there's not this stable grandparent structure in our household. It's just us. It's my husband and me and the kids, and he's got some contact with his family, and I kind of talk to my family, but not much. And we started talking about different things. And by the time I got to sitting down and writing the book, my youngest was 14. And they were actually the first one that read my book before I published. And they gave me extensive notes, which were really good. They're like, you didn't talk about this here. You didn't talk about this. You need to introduce this topic. And so they were really helpful in telling me, like, Mom, you need to tell this story a little better. But at the same time, like, they still didn't distance themselves from this story because I remember when I got home one day, my kid has the book open and they're crying tears. And they're like, Mom, I got to the part where you met Dad. I really hope it works out. And I was like, honey, he's upstairs. It worked out. And so I feel like there's this disconnect even with them where they hear the story, but they see me. And then
Yeah.
they hear the story again. And then they're like, well, but you're okay. And so I think even though they've heard little sprinkles of it throughout their lives, and 2 of them read at least half of the book, um, I think for them, they see me and they
Mm,
see that struggle, but they also see why I fight for young people because I think it's evident in the way that I raise them.
yeah.
Like my youngest, when they were little, they had their favorite homeless person. And so there was a guy that they would always take food to because that was the person that they identified as someone who was in need of food. And my kids have always gone with me to give people donations or give people what they need. And so they know that that's just what we do.
Mhm.
And so it's hard to say because I think they always were learning about who I was.
Mm-hmm.
but even when they knew who I was, they still didn't. And so I don't know. And now they say it's traumatic to read about my experiences, so now they won't read any more of it.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
complex.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can totally imagine. I think it's so interesting too that you brought up that, you apologize when, as you're parenting, when things go awry. And I know that even in the healthiest of families, if you want to call it healthiest in quotes, in our sort of generation, that wasn't a thing, nor was it a thing in the generations before. So in your situation, that's like a totally new concept for you to parent that way. And I admire that. I admire that so much because it just takes a lot to just go, yeah, I didn't handle that the best, and sometimes I'll feel myself like pulling back, like, but I'm the mom. And then I'm like, no, 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 don't do that. So yeah, I admire that a lot. And I loved, thank you for touching on the writing as part of your healing. Because one of the things I was going to ask about is actually something that somebody asked in the memoir panel that we were on. Somebody in the back had a question after we were done. You were asking questions, we were answering the questions, those of us on the panel. Somebody in the back said, basically, why didn't you use a pseudonym?
Mhm.
And for me, it's such a funny question because I had never thought of that before, which sounds odd, but it hadn't crossed my mind because I couldn't imagine building a character that was me, but it wasn't me. I don't know. So I was just wondering, as we kind of talk a little bit about your writing, and I want to be respectful of your time and everything. Again, thanks for coming on, but I just I'm fascinated to know why it is that you didn't choose one.
I think by the time I sat down to write this story, I felt safe to tell the story. I'd shared it a few times. Um, when I applied to my residency programs as a graduating medical student, I we had to write like a personal statement. And I wrote my 2-page statement on why I should train in family medicine, which was ultimately what I ended up training in. And I explained how I got there. And I talked about, my experiences with homelessness as a teenager as part of, developing that person that I am. And it was the first time that publicly I had, spoken my truths and in a way that could have been career sabotage. I had a few advisors who said, "You will not get any interviews with this."
Oh,
And then I
wow.
got a lot of interviews. I got a lot of interviews, and they were overwhelmingly positive, except for one of them.
Mm,
And they were very kind to me, and they wanted to know more about that story. But more than that, 4 of the directors that interviewed me at different programs across the country kind of planted that seed and said, "You need to write a book. We need to hear this story." And in my mind, I kept saying, "No, I'll write this book after my mom passes. I don't want to hurt my mom because I really don't blame her for what happened." She had profound mental illness and couldn't control some of the things that she did that caused harm.
mhm,
But, writing about it and talking about it, by the time I got to that point where I was ready to share that story, I had built a little community of people that, were pushing me forward. And I felt like I could share my story under my real name.
mhm,
I mean, there have been moments since then where, some people took it the wrong way, but for the most part, at least in the medical community, people have been incredibly supportive.
mhm. I'm so glad to hear that. That is such an incredible, really, hands-on way to you have the credentials, even without having the medical credentials. You have the street cred, if you will, to, be able to identify with these really difficult, multifaceted subjects and things that happen to kids. And um yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's like you sort of like the whole package. You can speak to so many different areas. And I admire it. I just think it's just an incredible thing. And so to be able to write that and be able to have that be in a tangible actual book for people to read and to digest. And I love that your way of healing, you know, doesn't have to look the same as somebody else's way of healing. I mean, there's something so powerful about that. And so thank you for sharing that. And, as we like start to wrap up, I just want to say, like, I wrote down like a few concepts that you touched on that I was just like, yeah. Um, when you were talking about, that mom's group, the one that was with the physicians, or you had a couple of them, and just having those people in your corner, right, who can totally identify, right, have, they're in the same place, right, and just building those, tying those threads to people so that you're not untethered, which was one of the words that you used. I love that word and that visual picture of being untethered and then tethered, so that when these life things happen, as they do, and storms come and go, you've got an anchor. And I love that. I thought that was just beautiful. And also, oh, this is a big one. Okay, so I wrote down, if it's basically not your story, it is not your story to tell, right? And I
Mhm.
think that that is such a huge concept that uh, just, I don't know, for me personally, anyway, it's a big, big deal. It gets overlooked. I grew up in a church where basically if you had anything going on, everybody knew about it because it was on the quote prayer chain,
Mhm.
unquote, but really it was like the gossip session. And so, yeah, I just want to say I'm sorry that that opportunity for you to have choice over when you told your story to your kids was taken away from you because somebody else took that from you. And I'm sorry about that. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you. And it's been amazing talking to you about all of these things. And I want to say my biggest take home message is, we all have a voice where we can advocate for young people. And if we all look outside and really see what's going on, and we see these tent cities across America, and we realize that, we have a choice. We can either allow it to become more like a developing country and leave people on the fringes of society where they just don't have hope or health or safety, or we can all stand up within our communities and make sure that we have access to housing, and we have great wraparound programs to help kids who are aging out of foster care, or kids that don't have safety at home because either there's massive poverty where there's not the ability to provide their needs, or they identify as LGBTQ and they're being pushed out of their society, their family, their communities. you know we all have an option to stand up, and we can talk to our legislators, we can go to our city council meetings, we can make sure that housing is on the table. We have to stand up. Right now we're at that point where it's a crisis, and I'm begging everyone, we have to do something, because I can't stand to see people out there. And when we look at the crazy weather patterns, the rain, the ice, the snow, the heat waves,
Mhm.
every single time that happens, I want everyone to think about people who are unhoused during that time. And if that doesn't fuel you, I don't know what will. But think about people at the most vulnerable moment.
Mhm.
And that has to be our motivation. We have to help everyone.
I literally have hair standing up right now on the back of my neck. This has just been such a powerful conversation. And that's funny because I was going to ask you what was your main message, and you could not have possibly summarized it any better. That's just very piercing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheryl, for coming on today. And really quick, I just want to have you do a little PS, which is what's next for you.
What's next? So I'm working on a graphic novel version of my book, hoping to draw that myself. And I just finished a course on that, so that's probably about a year away. And we're not talking about it much publicly, but there may be a film coming.
Mm, very exciting. Well, you deserve all good things, love and light to you. And I just wish you all the best. And thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I wish you the best as well.
Thank you.